Now, we've heard a lot about competition for capital earlier today. I'd like Mr. Nyman from Hess to step forward. John Sørensen from Rambøll Oil and Gas. Arne Holjem from NPD. And Mr. McConnell is here. And Michael Dietmar is here, I hope. Yes, he is, certainly. May I introduce somebody several of these you have not met. The head of the department, the Ministry for Growth and Industry in Denmark. Thank you very much for being with us, all of you. Yes, there is not too much space here. The microphones are open. You're free to say whatever you want at any time. But let me start with Mr. Nyman. There's a competition for capital. We've heard about that globally. In the boardrooms, you have to weigh investments in the North Sea against a multitude of other possible investments in oil or gas in anywhere, really. Your company is capable of operating in any environment in the world. What would you consider the most attractive element of the Danish continental shelf?
Thank you, Martin. You're correct. Hess is transformed into a pure play E&P, and we have a global portfolio where we place our resources strategically. We've invested 12 billion kroner in the South Arne development, and we've been here for 20 years operating the South Arne field. It is, of course, in any investment we do, we weigh that and rank that against our other opportunities in the Gulf of Mexico, West of Africa, and also in our onshore, unconventional business. So when we look towards Denmark, one of the things that are determining is that indeed we have a very predictable and transparent framework, which allows us to maybe have a lower risk on those aspects compared to other places where we operate. What's important to us is that indeed if you are to make changes to these kinds of frameworks, that you base that on a robust dialogue and you take science data into those decisions, and you allow ample time for the companies such as us and the investors to have time to react to these changes. So we're very pleased to see the national strategy that the minister has started, and we think that's a very important piece of work, bringing the industry together and partnering between regulators, the government and the industry to come up with a set of recommendations. So that's what we find is very important.
Right. John Sørensen, a similar question to you. Rambøll in Danish oil and gas is heavily engaged in a global strategy, buying new companies and growing across the world. But we're obviously interested also in knowing what will it take for your activities in Denmark to continue to grow.
That we have got an interesting environment, and that's it will be an interesting and development facilitating environment if it is so for our clients. That means at the end of the day we'll make a good living out of it if our clients make a good living out of it. And the clients will only make a good living out of it if the state makes a good living out of it, and that means at the end of the day that we should try and endeavor to make the entire pie bigger, because then there will be something in for everybody there. And I think that's the challenge that we are actually facing, but we are progressing on this one. And as Anders just said, with the new strategy work, where everybody is participating and chipping in, we are finding a development that we didn't have only 3 years ago, before Oil Gas Denmark was actually formed. So everybody is participating now, but we have to be open-minded to the change that we face now. As mentioned on the last panel here, that there will be a change for everybody here.
And from your perspective, a growth business, to say the least, what is the main obstacle in the years ahead? I mean, we've heard many times now how complicated developments, the continued developments in the North Sea will be. And we've heard some of the challenges that the regulatory agencies are now identifying. From your point of view, what is the main challenge? Where is the problem?
I think the problem is that we are all fighting for the same capital, whether it's the human capital that we're talking about, like us as a service industry are fighting for that. We will have to ensure that the business, as Søren many times has said,
right.
It has to be sexy in the future as well. So we have to really point towards that. Everybody, including the government, will have to acknowledge that and actually speak up that it is sexy to be in this industry. From the industry point of view, we have to challenge ourselves with the fact that we are in an industry with less good margins. I mean, from the Danish perspective compared with Norway or Denmark, there's less discoveries, they're smaller, they're more difficult. But we still also have the positive side, as we heard earlier today, with cost per barrel produced, which is actually quite competitive. We can compete with our neighbors there.
But obviously also, I mean, we heard from Mackenzie the number of challenges seen from an investor's point of view that the North Sea projects. Mr. Holyam, why would any investor in 2 years from now find the Danish shelf interesting at all?
I think it starts with exploration. I think that you need to make it attractive to explore, and you can make small discoveries that can be pulled together to make a development. But if you don't drill exploration wells, you're not going to get anywhere. So something that makes it more attractive to drill more exploration wells, I think that's a good start.
What would that be?
Well, it's difficult for me to say what that would be. We had a problem in Norway in the beginning of year 2000. We drilled almost no exploration wells. So we had to do something. So several things were done. There were some changes made to the fiscal regime. So there was an incentive there which aligned the newcomers with the ones that were in the tax-paying position. We made some road shows around the world to promote the Norwegian continental shelf. And all these things combined, it really made a difference. And the number of exploration wells really picked up.
How does one make international investors interested in the Danish shelf?
I think the point about whether it's sexy or not is a good one. You know, there's a lot of investment going into what's seen to be sexy at the moment. That's US unconventionals. That's where investors are putting their money, and that's where people are looking at. People are looking more longer term at places like Mexico, which might start to open up quite a lot in the future. So I think offering a long-term value proposition is what people want. And there is a certain amount of herd following, I suppose, in the investor community. I'm sorry if anyone's offended by that, but so yeah, I think giving something that investors want to invest in and some returns that look attractive is what people want.
Mr. Dietmar, there's one thing we cannot accuse the Norwegians of. They do have a lot of experience in this field. I think we need to agree on that. Mr. Holyam knows everything about this. He says incentives, roadshows, in order to create more drillings. This is the way forward. What will you do to achieve that?
I don't think that's an easy question to answer. I think I agree with very much what's been said up here, that we need to look, is the environment we've set up for the North Sea, is that competitive? And when we talk about competitive, I think in the first hand we have to look for Norway and the UK. That's a part of the world where we are. And that's also, I think, part of the thing we have, with the new strategy we are working on, that we have to look on national rules. We have to look on the infrastructure and third-part access and so on. And we also, of course, need to look at the issue about competences. How can we attract competences? How can we ensure that we have the necessary qualified labor force and so on? I do not think there's just one thing you can say about it, but clearly, I think, of course, Norway is a much bigger impact. Norway, the gas and oil sector. In this country, it's about close to 3% of GDP, but still, it's an important sector. And I think the work we are doing is really to see how can we try to also create growth within this sector. How can we make sure that we use our natural resources in the best way? And I think that's also why we have started this work on this strategy, which I think is part of and was a recommendation from one of our growth teams, the growth team we set down on energy, saying that in many areas we are looking into what can we do in order to ensure that also our regulation and the administration and so on, we're doing this in a growth-friendly way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way we can approach, of course it could turn out that maybe in Mexico and some other parts of the world, everything will be beautiful, everything will be much better, and of course then the capital will move. But we're not that sure, and we're not said that we don't believe, even if there are, of course, there are issues in the North Sea we have to look into. Not everything is easy, but I think you have to up till now, I think we have had interest from oil companies coming in and would like to invest.
But certainly we've heard earlier on from very trustworthy sources in the international consultancies that, Mr. Newman, that new investors are the active ones. The majors are not really investing as such in what we're talking about here. We're looking at new types of investors. We're looking at a very restricted capital market for these types of investments in marginal fields. Is more exploration, is that the way forward to attract these new types of investors?
There's a number of factors. It's not one single thing that's going to do it. The South Arne field has been a relatively mature field where we've invested 8.6 billion kroner to increase the recovery from 25 to 29%. So that's an example of a marginal investment in a mature area. I think looking back, we did the Quartz report, which concludes that the Danish sector is, the remaining potential is vast, it's big, it's there, it's characterized by smaller marginal fields discoveries, and it's relatively difficult oil. So I think we need to appreciate that in the national strategy work. We need to appreciate the composition of the potential we have and then tailor some of the framework around releasing that. Then I think it will be interesting to a whole suite of investors, both companies like Hess that can leverage technologies, for instance, from our US unconventionals to reduce well costs and then free up some potential there, and other smaller companies may bring other things to the table. So I think there's a diversity needed to release the potential.
Mr. Sørensen, the strategy work that is now outlined by the minister, by the department and the government, what will it take because you can sink a lot of time and money into a strategy that doesn't bring you anywhere. How does one avoid that pitfall? How does one attract investors and activities, new drillings in the short term?
Well, to do something different than compared with what we're doing today. Something has to change. And I think and the key word, which is the elephant in the room, is really incentive, and incentive in that manner is tax at the end of the day. Something has to change that we get the last drop out of the ground, what's possible to get out, which will bring value to all parties, all three elements, the government, the oil companies and the service companies.
Mr. McConnell, from your global insights, is tax incentives really the only way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably agree with that. Like, it certainly needs something to. I think, yeah, I mean, something needs to attract. Certainly, if we're talking about short term, I mean, I think there is a limited amount that you can change in the short term on a technology basis. So, making a big change like changing tax incentives would surely have a pretty dramatic effect, I think.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'll ask Mr. Dietmar and Mr. O'Connell to stay on, please.